Today we're reviewing the Be Quiet Silent Bass 802 case, which is actually a really interesting case because it does this. It's got two panel options. It is convertible into either an airflow focused build with more mesh or a silence focused build, as Be Quiet is known for, mostly featuring very thick and prevalent foam all over the place. So really cool to see this. This is sort of more of the Cooler Master approach to offering two options within one case rather than maybe the Fractal approach, where you're offering multiple different SKUs, all of which have a very specialized focus. So with the 802, we're going to look at the solid panel testing and the noise impact to the extent we do noise testing right now, and we'll be looking at the mesh performance versus the other mesh-focused cases. This one is priced in a way that it lands right in the middle of a bunch of other cases we've reviewed lately, so let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Squarespace. Squarespace is what we've been using for years to manage our own Gamers Nexus store, and we've been incredibly happy with the choice. Squarespace makes e-commerce easy for those interested in starting stores, but it also has powerful tools to build all types of websites. Photo galleries for photographers, resume and portfolio sites, and small business sites are all easily done through Squarespace. Having built a lot of client websites the old way before running GN full-time, we can easily recommend Squarespace as a powerful, fast solution. Go to squarespace.com/gamersnexus to get 10% off your first purchase with Squarespace. So this case comes out to $170 in the configuration we're looking at, with this large glass panel that's got a good amount of mechanical complexity to it we'll be talking about in this review. In the non-glass version with two steel panels instead, it's $160. So it's sort of it's approaching the expensive range of cases. Cases right now, we're starting to see more in the $100 to $200 range, and it seems like things come in waves like this. So for this one, it lands in the middle of some of the other ones we've looked at lately. The Fractal XL case, for example, would be somewhat nearby in price. The Lian Li O11 XL nearby in price. And for Be Quiet, if you're not familiar with their naming scheme, it's pretty simple. So they've got pure bass. Actually, all their products is the same way. It's pure for the cheaper stuff, silent for their sort of mid-range to approaching high-end, and then dark or dark bass in the situation of cases being the high-end or what they want to be seen as the premium components. So this is in the silent bass lineup, and a couple of the things that we really want to direct attention to in this particular review, and you'll hear this in Patrick's build notes, is just, again, the mechanics of it, where stuff like this is becoming a little bit more common, but we still get excited to see it. With just a radiator tray or a fan tray where it sockets in up top, slides out very easily, super simple to install, and then again, the glass panel, they've gone through the trouble and cost, which obviously is passed on to you, but still, of adding in some additional supports on it, making it a little more complex than just a panel with some bolts through it. There are modular pieces inside. There's an option to invert the case. We don't necessarily recommend it. It's kind of a pain to invert cases, but it gives you something unique and plenty of options for cooling. So this case is situated in a way where mechanically, it is one of the most interesting that we've looked at lately. Fractal has been up there in terms of high quality mechanics as well. And when we say mechanics with a case, what we're really talking about is just how does everything feel? How does it socket together? What are the modular parts? Do they make sense or are they gimmicks? Things of that nature. So this so far is off to a good start, where again, it's got that semi-Cooler Master approach of here's two options, you figure it out which one you want to use, instead of offering multiple different SKUs. So let's get into the build notes. We'll talk through all of the finer details of the build quality of this. Then we'll have the usual thermal and acoustic testing with a bit more of a focus on discussion of acoustics this time, given the nature of the foam panels. And we'll talk about whether the case is worth it or not for you. The most notable feature of the 802 in comparison to its predecessors is that it includes mesh options for the top cover and front panel. For our thermal testing, covered later in the review, we defined two basic configurations, but you're free to mix and match the individual pieces. For our fully noise-damped configuration, we used the heavy steel and plastic front panel, which has a centimeter thick of acoustic foam applied to the inner surface. When using this front panel, air is drawn mostly from the two mesh wings on either side. We also used the two-part plastic cover. The front section of the cover is an unventilated plastic sheet backed by a sheet of 2 millimeters of acoustic foam, while the rear section is bare plastic with vents cut into it. The rationale for separating the panel into two sections isn't entirely clear. One half could be installed without the other, but Be Quiet never mentions this possibility or shows it. It may help with creating unusual airflow paths when inverting the case, or maybe it's just a manufacturing choice. Finally, we used the plastic power supply shroud covers in this testing. The surface of the PSU shroud is covered with removable plastic plates that hide a ventilated surface underneath. The function of the covers is to make the power supply area look clean, which isn't a priority for us. They also block off the shroud top cable cutouts, making it difficult to route anything other than the thinnest of cables under their edges. Separately, for our airflow focused configuration, we used the mesh front panel and mesh top filter, as well as removing the plastic covers from the surface of the PSU shroud. Color matching between the plastic and metal elements of the case is good on at least the black variant, which is the one we received for review. Be Quiet has plenty of experience making black cases and white cases, but they used to have orange accents, and the orange accents found on some older models are now gone, with a choice between all black or black and white color schemes. As with many Be Quiet cases, with the notable exception being the 500DX, there are no RGB LEDs whatsoever in the Silent Bass 802. Despite that, the hexagonal bracing in the mesh front panel lines up with the bracing on the nylon filter, which helps with backlighting from LED fans. All three case fans are unassuming Silentwings 2 140mm models rated for 1000 RPM. We haven't formally tested Be Quiet's fans on their own, but past experience with their cases suggests that relatively low noise output on these fans is related to the fact that they just don't spin very fast. There's a fan controller present that takes a SATA power connection and a PWM signal, or 4-pin power header, as input and controls up to 6 fans via DC, or 3-pin headers. Speed is adjusted with a switch on the front of the case with 3 static speed settings and 1 auto setting, which uses the incoming PWM signal. Other front panel connections include 2 USB 3.2 Type A ports, 1 USB 3.2 Type C port, separate 3.5mm mic and headphone jacks, a reset button, and a hard drive light. More is better in our opinion for I/O, and we appreciate that Be Quiet included a full complement compared to the 500DX's pared down offering. The power supply is attached to a bracket and inserted from the rear of the case, which is a feature that we generally like to see in these cases. Clearance seems unusually limited for the 802, but it shouldn't be a problem as long as power supplies strictly follow the ATX form factor specifications. But any power supply with stickers or projections that push the width or height even fractionally beyond 15 centimeters or 8.5 centimeters respectively will be a tight fit. Speaking of, ignore the eATX compatibility claim. Installing anything wider than a standard ATX board will cover the cable cutouts on the motherboard tray, and there are no standoffs to support form factors wider than ATX, like SSI CEB or SSI EEB. Cables could be routed through the holes meant for the hard drive bays instead, but at that point, it's messy, and it would be more practical to just shop for a different case. Radiator compatibility is advertised as 360mm in the top and 420mm in the front. Both claims here are true this time, and front radiators have about 3 centimeters of clearance, total thickness, before they conflict with any floating hard drive bays that could be installed. We complimented the optional mesh top cover of the PureBase 500DX in that review for the effort that was put into its design, ensuring that it fits snugly into the indent in the top of the case. It used a combination of small magnets at the corners and long magnetic strips along the edges to keep the filter in place. The 802 also has an optional mesh top cover, but it uses magnetic strips exclusively, several of which fell off during shipping. The adhesive used by Be Quiet doesn't work well on the metal mesh, which is more open than the mesh on the 500DX and therefore leaves relatively little space to stick to. Upon re-examining the filter of the 500DX though, it's prone to the same problem to a lesser degree. Moreover, there are plastic rivets underneath the magnets on the 500DX that must be melted flat to allow the magnets to make good contact. We hope that Be Quiet can find a middle ground that doesn't require more expensive manual labor and also doesn't fall apart in the mail. And when this thing was shipped, it's not like it was hot anywhere en route, so it wasn't exposed to high temperatures while sitting in a truck. The manual for the Be Quiet 802 uses as few words as possible to ease translation. Most of the diagrams are still fairly helpful, with the exception of the directions for inverting the case, which are step 1, a picture of the case in its original layout, and step 2, the case is now inverted. Congratulations. It's like instructions for learning how to draw or paint, so thanks a lot, Be Quiet, for the detailed info. There's a QR code beneath the diagram that should logically lead to a video of this process, but instead, it's recursive. It leads to a PDF of the same manual that the QR code is printed in, including the QR code at the end. You could do this infinitely. Inversion in the 802 is easier than it is for the Dark Bass Pro 900, or even Cooler Master's efforts with the Cosmos case, but it's still an involved process. Basically, the rear of the case and motherboard tray can be unscrewed and detached as a single unit, then flipped. The complicating factors are cosmetic, like flipping the orientation of the power supply shroud and ensuring that the front panel connectors are routed through the side of the case that doesn't have a window. We'd suggest visiting Be Quiet's YouTube channel for instructions if this is something you are even thinking about doing before buying the case. Because of the case's chamfered edges, the flat area of the top panel is much narrower than the case itself, at 16.4 centimeters versus just over 24 centimeters. That's the listed width of the case, including the legs. This makes it look as if the top of the case may be too narrow to fit 140mm fans or radiators, but both are compatible. There's still an issue. The top radiator mount is offset from center, which is a common strategy to avoid clearance issues on the motherboard, but that means that the 140mm wide, and to an even greater extent the 120mm wide, cooling components don't line up with the narrow vent on the top. In addition, the cutouts in the top fan tray are all 8 centimeters wide, so a significant portion of the 140mm wide top-mounted fans and radiators will be blocked off by the fan tray itself. Other than that, though, the top fan tray is constructed excellently. It slides out on plastic rails installed at the front and the rear of the case, which are representative of the level of detail found throughout the case. Rather than just screwing the tray into the chassis itself, Be Quiet chose a solution that requires multiple extra parts that have to be manufactured with relatively fine tolerances and then screwed together, not riveted, just to make it a little bit easier to use. The side panels, for example, are assembled with multiple pieces of metal, glass, elaborately molded plastic, and foam weather strips to seal the edges. Hooks at the top engage the holes in the chassis that contain spring-loaded latches controlled by buttons. Both latches and the chassis have ventilation holes punched through them above the top fan mount to ensure that some hot air can still leave the case through the tiny gap in the side panels and the top panel, even if the non-ventilated top cover is installed. This level of overkill is what we've come to expect from Be Quiet. Their mid-range and high-end cases aren't cheap, but it's clear where the prices come from. On the subject of the side panels, they're both solidly constructed and heavy, yet can support their own weight when the eject buttons are pressed without flopping out onto the desk. The steel noise-damped side panel uses the same centimeter-thick foam as the front panel, which adds some motivation for proper cable management. Any connectors that aren't strapped down flush with the motherboard tray will dig into the foam, leaving indents. One 120 or 140mm fan can be mounted to the top of the power supply shroud, and there are also 120 or 140mm fan mounts that run the length of the bottom of the case. Be Quiet doesn't really mention these or their existence in the case's product sheet though, which is probably a good move just because they're of limited usefulness. The 802 also has space for two 3.5-inch drives installed under the shroud, and further a drive in a single floating bay, which can be installed in one of the 5 slots in the case body. The floating bay is the same kind that Be Quiet has been using for years, and extras can be purchased separately from some German retailers. Failing that, there are some listed on eBay at the time of this writing for about $18 each. Time to get into thermal testing. We made the decision to stick primarily to the airflow configuration that we mentioned earlier for testing. All silent base 802s ship with the necessary parts to be configured the same way we did here. Unless otherwise mentioned, these tests were performed with the airflow configuration, using the mesh front panel, the mesh top filter, and no plastic covers on top of the power supply shroud. We have a couple of the solid panel tests in here as well. We'll start with just the silent base cases on a separate chart. In the airflow configuration, CPU temperature averaged 50 degrees Celsius above ambient. Removing the front panel entirely, but leaving the nylon filter in place, lowered that to 47 degrees, while switching to the silent configuration raised it to 58 degrees. The first result indicates that the metal mesh front panel isn't an unreasonable obstacle to airflow, while the second result confirms what we already knew from previous testing of Be Quiet cases, and that's that sealing all the vents makes the computer hot. The largest contributor to heat here is the noise-damped front panel, sealing off almost all of the intake area. It becomes such a problem because, for better or worse, Be Quiet uses baffles and zigzags in the airflow path as a means to suppress noise. It's a smart design, and it is intentional. This intentional design, though, makes the thermals not great. But criticizing the 802's thermals is somewhat different than criticizing the thermals of cases that lack such justifications, or really any intentional design other than handing a crayon to a child, as seen in many cases. With past cases, like the 800 or the 801, you just had to either prioritize noise damping over airflow or buy a different case entirely. We support Be Quiet's decision to ship the case with an alternate front panel this time, allowing users to pull air straight into the case if they desire. The noise-damped top panel also keeps some heat from leaving passively, but this is a minor issue compared to the front panel's interference with active cooling. Comparatively, the Be Quiet 500DX averaged just 1 degree cooler in this test at 49 degrees Celsius over ambient. The 500DX is Be Quiet's most specifically airflow-focused case, so for the 802 to almost match it is a respectable achievement. 50 degrees is a decent average compared to the rest of the chart as a whole, although it's warmer than many of our preferred airflow cases. It's approximately tied with the new Fractal Meshify 2 cases, especially the non-XL, which is a close competitor to at least the new airflow config of the 802, and the silent configuration of the 802 is closer to Fractal's Define 7, which averaged 63 degrees over ambient in this test compared to the 802's 58 degrees. The baseline GPU torture result was 54 degrees Celsius above ambient. Removing the mesh panel lowered it to 53 degrees, and switching to the silent configuration raised it to 56 degrees. Our airflow configuration included removing all the plastic covers on top of the power supply shroud, and since the entire bottom of the case underneath the PSU shroud is ventilated, this does create a little more breathing room around the GPU. Still, swapping the front panel is the single largest factor in changing case temperature here. The 500DX is a little further ahead of the 802's 54 degree average with an average of 52 degrees for its own result, which is also what Fractal's Meshify 2 achieved in this test. The Define 7's 53 degree average also beats the 802's 56 degree average in silent configuration, and so GPU cooling isn't the 802's forte. But comparing this to the limited selection of cases we've just read off would cast it in a more negative light, whereas moving to noise-normalized testing later could potentially lift this one up a bit. 54 degrees baseline is on the warm side of average between the meh performance of the stock Cooler Master NR600 and the Define S2 Meshify. We expect the 802 to come into its own in noise-normalized testing, which again is coming up shortly. First though, more stress testing results. With the 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme test on loop, average GPU temperature rose to 52 degrees above ambient. Rounding makes the difference from baseline seem larger than it is. The Firestrike average is 1.6 degrees below the original torture test result. This stress test loads the GPU much more heavily than the CPU, so trapped exhaust from the CPU cooler doesn't contribute as much to thermals, if any is present, when testing with Firestrike. Average CPU temperature during Blender CPU rendering of our usual monkey head test scene was 37 degrees Celsius above ambient, while the 500DX and Meshify 2 tied at 36 degrees. 37 is still competitive, tied with the P400A. With the ubiquitous 2 intake fans and 1 rear exhaust fan stock configuration, CPU air cooling in the 802 is reliably good. GPU temperature when rendering the same scene on the GPU averaged 24 degrees above ambient, tied for once with the Meshify 2 and a degree cooler than the 500DX. This test and the Firestrike test both load the GPU with minimal heat generated by the CPU, and in both instances, GPU cooling improved versus a full system load. The standardized fan test allows us to directly compare the performance of cases in a way that isn't determined by the stock configuration, giving useful information to anyone who intends to replace or augment the stock fans. With the 802, we directly replaced the two 140mm Silent Wings 2 intake fans with the standardized Noctua set in exactly the same positions, and replaced the exhaust fan with the standardized 120mm exhaust fan in the same position. We continued to use the airflow configuration for testing though. CPU temperature averaged 48 degrees Celsius above ambient in this test, below the 50 degree baseline and close to the 47 degree result with no front panel. As we've said before, Be Quiet's fans aren't especially fast, which is part of the reason they're quiet. Using the Noctua fans kept the 500DX ahead with a 46 degree average, as well as the Meshify 2 at 47 degrees average. GPU temperature also improved versus baseline, down to 50 degrees average. Relative to other results, that's the best GPU temperature the 802 has gotten so far, between the 500DX's warmer 51 degree average and the P300A's cooler 47 degree average. Stronger fans encourage a more normal airflow pattern here. Noise testing is next. We test noise with a straight dBA reading at 100% case fan speed for baseline, and then we'll also have a noise-normalized result. The airflow configuration was measured to be 39 dBA, while the silent configuration was measured to be 36.2 dBA, an audible difference, and one that actually shows up on the meter. Reducing the airflow configuration's noise level to our 36 dBA threshold, however, required reducing the case fan speeds to 80%. While the silent configuration was already so close to the threshold that the torture result we already ran can be seen as the noise-normalized result, since it's already there. At 100% set fan speed with the mesh front panel, the case fans ran just over 1000 RPM, and at 80% fan speed, they ran at just under 900 RPM. Starting with CPU temperatures, the mesh configuration averaged 51 degrees above ambient, while the silent configuration averaged 58 degrees above ambient. As we've reiterated many times in the past, it's easier to get balanced cooling and noise levels in a well-ventilated case by just turning the fan speed down, rather than trying to muffle the noise with sealed panels and foam. We expect that the sealed-off approach would still be more effective at dealing with certain types of noise that isn't directly connected to fan speed, like, for example, coil whine or pump noise, or even mechanical hard drives. Anything that's higher frequency might be better dealt with by these panels, and that wouldn't show up in this current approach to testing. When it comes to fan noise, that running slow and open rather than fast and sealed is almost always preferable for thermals. 51 degrees places fairly competitively on the noise normalized chart, tied with mesh cases like the P400A RGB and the Meshify 2, while Lian Li's LanCool 215 still tops the chart with its larger and slower 200mm intake fans. 58 degrees with the sealed front panel isn't as good, to say the least, landing alongside the Fractal Define S2 Vision RGB and the Nova Mesh TG, neither of which did well in general testing. GPU temperature followed the same trend, with the mesh result unchanged from baseline at 54 degrees above ambient, and the silent result higher at 56 degrees average. Again, GPU cooling isn't especially strong in the 802, with the more favorable 54-degree result only tying it with Be Quiet's own 500DX. Be Quiet cases, in the recent ones we've looked at least, are really full of details, and that's a good thing for the most part, except, wow, that's convenient, isn't it? Check that out. So that is one of the downsides of this case, where these magnetic strips are peeling off. These just came off right when I actually haven't personally taken this off yet. Patrick did that earlier, and that's instantly what happened my first experience with it. So they use adhesive to be held on there. It was not on there when we got it. We've put it back on a few times and it keeps falling off. This is a minor detail. It's something that you could fix with just basically some glue if you wanted to fix it. But it's one of those minor details where, despite all of the really strong mechanics and overall build quality of this case, there are shortcomings where Be Quiet's got a couple things that could improve. And most products we've looked at, when they involve glue, things do start falling apart. But more recently in cases, the Lian Li O11 had a problem where the front panel on ours, after some time that we had it, it did fall off and we had to re-glue it back on. So not the first time we've seen glue fall apart. At least this time it's not on a part that's glass. For the most part, this is a well-made case. It's built well. To the extent that you might care about it, there's a bit of that psychological effect where you pick up different components of it and they have a certain feel to them of quality. It doesn't necessarily mean it is quality, but in the instance of this case overall, it tends to correlate positively with quality. At $160, there are multiple options on the market depending on what's available in your region in the stock. So cases to maybe consider, if you like this case, doing your full research on other options out there, would be the new Fractal series. So they've got the new Meshify 2 series, including the Meshify 2 XL. There's also the Cooler Master H500 series, so the H500P Mesh, the H500M, a bit more expensive, or the H500 Blank, but that's getting a little bit lower end than this case is targeted at. Lian Li's O11 XL is probably worth looking at for you, especially if you're considering water cooling. And then if you like stuff from Be Quiet, the 500DX might make a lot of sense. It's an airflow focused case. It really only tries to do one thing. It's got a bit more of RGB flare in it. Well, infinitely more because you can't divide by zero, but the 500DX would be a good one to look at that we were overall positive on as well. As for where this case fits the best, for whom it might work the best, you get a lot of noise focused features. So if you're not going airflow focused, although in our testing, you can normalize the silent version of the case and the mesh version of the case to the same noise level and get better overall thermal performance with the mesh version. There is still something to be said for foam, which is that certain types of noises, like high frequency ones that might show up at the same volume or the same dBA reading, but potentially be more annoying, those in theory, in the at least mathematics version of making this case, should be better controlled by the foam panels on this. Now, whether or not that happens in reality, whether or not you notice a difference, because anything that's audio is extremely subjective, that's a different story, but in theory it should work better. So if you are really sensitive to certain types of noise and it matters a lot to you to do anything you can to try and mitigate it, even if it's not really 100% clear whether it's really gonna help, then this might be a case worth looking into. If it's more about just overall volume for you, then normalizing the noise levels by reducing the fan speed and putting mesh on there is going to get you in a better position. And you could even still, if you wanted to, normalize for thermals. So meaning if we set the same thermal target, your case would be quieter in terms of the fan speeds with the mesh version, which is not news. We've shown this before, but just stuff to think about. So for a larger case, with noise damping, with room for more drives, and with wider radiator compatibility, the Silent Bass 802 is a good option, we think. The pricing puts it in the middle of a lot of other cases out there. It is definitely erring a little bit on the higher end. You're probably buying this if you have a more expensive computer. So you want cheaper options, 500DX, Corsair 4000D, some of the other cases we mentioned earlier would be good places to look. But overall good. Some fit and finish issues, like again, this falling apart a bit. And then there is something to be said of the approach they're taking here, where you get two panels or multiple sets of panels, where you as a consumer are spending more for those, even though you're probably only ever going to use one set. So that's a little bit of a downside. It's not a huge cost increase, but a company like Fractal is taking the multi-SKU approach instead, where you buy this case and it does this thing, and that's all there is to it. And that does cut costs a little bit, and it cuts the amount of excess materials that are included with it. But otherwise, as a case, this is one of the better ones we've looked at recently. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. You can subscribe for more as always. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to pick up one of our toolkits, teardown toolkits, or our mouse mats or other items. And we'll see you all next time.